On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to discuss what I feel is one of the most ominous signs of the end time. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 31, the Bible describes people whose minds are reprobate, who have a society who has turned against God. And among the many things that these verses talk about, being filled with unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, backbiters, haters of God, and so on, without understanding covenant breakers, and then this ominous statement, without natural affection. On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to discuss a society without natural affection. Gary Stimman is here to discuss with me the many tragedies we have been watching across America in these days.
Tragedies that are almost beyond comprehension, J.R. And we're going to be looking at two passages of Scripture. The one J.R. just read in Romans chapter 1 and then one in 2 Timothy chapter 3. The little phrase, seemingly almost innocuous, innocent-sounding phrase, without natural affection. And yet, when you find out what that means, particularly in the context of what's going on in today's world, you will be chilled to the marrow of your bones.
To give you an idea, in Union, South Carolina, a while back, Susan Smith drowns her own two children because her lover doesn't want to have children around.
Yeah.
This is just one of many things that we've been hearing in the news and reading about that just makes today's society sickening. But indeed, it is indicative of the prophecy. I've read to you from Romans chapter 1, and we'll discuss this in great length on today's program. Gary, what about the message to Timothy?
The message to Timothy, J.R., is a prophetic message. And let me just read, as we begin here, that the context of 2 Timothy 3 is a prophetic message Paul gave to Timothy, and he says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." We've discussed this phrase many times, and J.R., the perilous times means ragingly insane. The Greek word is kalepos, which means, in fact, the only other place in the New Testament where this word is used is when Jesus comes upon the demoniac from Gadara, who's raging and foaming at the mouth, and several men couldn't hold him down. And he's described with this same word. It means ragingly insane. And Paul says, "For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection." A harmless, innocent little phrase. And yet the Greek word from which this is taken is the Greek word astorgos. Astorgos means having no affection for your immediate group. And that would be your husband or your wife, your children, your near relatives, or your peer group, your friends. In other words, it means that you are without affection for your family group, your close-knit associates. Now, it's a natural thing to have affection for those close around you. And yet, Paul says, no, 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 there will come a time when men will not have natural affection.
Can you imagine what Susan Smith was thinking when she strapped her two children into the back seat of the car and then drove that car, watched it drive off into the river, hearing the children's screams, the terrifying noises that came from that car as she stood there and watched it go down beneath the water. What she did must be indicative of a deep problem, not only in her life, but across America.
That's right.
In society itself.
Now, up until Susan Smith did that awful, shameful deed, most people would have said a mother's love for children is something unbreakable, something unassailable, something that could not possibly be broached or breached. And look what happened. It was broken. She let her boys drown for personal motives. That is a complete breakdown of what the Bible terms natural affection.
Melissa Drexler in Lacey Township, New Jersey, went to a prom and went into the bathroom, had a baby, and put the baby in a trash can and went back to the prom to dance some more.
That is correct, and this is just an amazing story. I'm sure you remember reading about it yourself. According to an Asbury Park Press News article I'm reading here, Melissa Drexler thought she was still 3 weeks away from giving birth when she went to this prom. She went to the prom, went into labor, and rather than destroy her prom experience with her boyfriend, she delivered the child, and authorities through autopsy later learned that it had been alive when she put it in a trash can, wrapped it up, threw it in the trash, went back out onto the prom floor, and continued for the rest of the evening at the prom without natural affection. It's a perfect definition.
In Jonesboro, Arkansas, 2 young children, Mitchell Johnson and Andrew Golden, one 11 years old, the other 13 years old, according to this Newsweek article, killed their classmates and teachers. It's shocking to think that they could do such a thing. One only 13, the other 11. Raised around guns, they're accused of opening fire on their schoolmates and teachers on an Arkansas afternoon. And the question here, why do kids kill? Gary, this has to be indicative of something, because children 11 and 13 years of age would not normally do something like that. They had to be taught in a very drastic way to do something like that.
And that's exactly what we're going to look into today. What has happened? Speaking of kids killing, and we're just surrounded by a tabletop full of magazines and newspapers with articles. We may not get to them all. Yeah. Speaking of kids killing kids, here's the beating of a 1-month-old baby. Ignacio Bermudez Jr. was dumped from his bassinet, pummeled with fists, kicked and possibly hit with a stick, leaving his skull cracked. His alleged assailants were twin brothers, 8 years of age, along with another boy aged 6 who beat this little 1-month-old to death, and had, according to the description, had a good time doing it. They had the time of their lives.
In Richmond, California.
That's right.
Incredible. What causes these things? Well, let's begin with what the Scripture has to say, because this chapter, this first chapter of Romans that concludes with without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Where does it all start? Back up a few verses. Because when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but were vain in their foolish imaginations, or vain in their imaginations, and the foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man, to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So God gave them up, the Scripture says, to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator. You know, Gary, it all starts when people think they're so smart. Mm-hmm. They decide that there is no God.
That's right.
That God does not exist, and therefore they came through the process of evolution. We're talking about birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, and changed the truth of God into a lie, served the creature more than the Creator. This is where it all starts, with evolution being introduced into our society.
Yeah, and before there was evolution, there was idolatry in every age. For example, in Egypt, all the gods had the bodies of men and the heads of animals. In other words, they worshipped the creation. Today, you may watch on television and you'll see an endless parade of programs that are giving glory to evolution.
And it broke out in society when the women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their own lust toward one another, men with men. Homosexuality. And that's where the cancer crops out openly into society, and all of these other things are an inevitable result.
All you have to do is deny God, and then as though you go down a slippery slope after that, faster and faster and faster, and at the end you become cold without natural affection. Cold cold-blooded, and you are one who is capable of committing atrocities. You know, it's been said, J.R., that man without God becomes like an animal.
Mm-hmm. When the Supreme Court decided back in the early 60s that God would no longer be welcome in America's classrooms, I believe God wrote Ichabod across America. And we have seen the inevitable result. We have more to tell you, and we'll be back in just a moment, so don't go away. We have before us on this table dozens of stories that point out a grievous truth, a sinister design by the devil himself to destroy humanity. And the Bible tells us, the Bible gives it a name. It says, without natural affection. And we have indeed seen this in these days. And Gary, it's growing worse and worse. Every day it's proliferating. It's out of control.
As a matter of fact, while we were collecting stories to bring this feature to you, it just so happened that today's Daily Oklahoma, the very day in which we're making this program, has a top story headlined, "Ex-Daycare Provider Charged, Woman Facing Trial Denies Shaking 6-Month-Old to Death." The story is about a daycare worker who shook a 6-month-old baby to death and is now in jail. It just goes on and on and on.
And these stories appear every day across America.
With increasing frequency. The New York Times, this one happens to be the April 24th, has a story. I'm sure that many of you who are watching are familiar with this story. Man charged with infecting son with blood tainted by HIV, and the reason he did it was so he wouldn't have to pay child support. Here's the story. The man separated from his wife, seeking divorce, did not want to pay child support. He infected his son. He happened to be a medical tech of some sort. He infected his own son with HIV so that the boy would die and he would not have to pay child support. How's that for cold? Unbelievable.
That's incredible. And then there was the mother, Awilda Lopez, in New York City, who took her little daughter, Elisa, after 6 years of abuse, continual abuse. She took that 6-year-old just a few days from her 7th birthday and smashed her head against a brick wall, killed her.
Then we have in the Time magazine, this one, or the Newsweek magazine, this one happens to be November 10th, 1997, the story of the au pair, the British au pair, that is a child care girl coming over on an exchange program, living with a family in the East. And this girl was found guilty of murdering the boy she was charged with keeping, and of course denied having done anything wrong, but a jury of the peers in that community found her guilty of murder.
There was the 2 children in Chicago, I believe it was Chicago, the 2 boys that took a neighbor child and held him out the window by his feet upside down and then dropped him, I think, about 4 stories to his death.
That's right.
Just absolutely incredible. There was Amy Grossberg and Brian Peterson in Newark, Delaware, who gave birth to a baby, and they both conspired together, killed the child, put it in a garbage bag, and then in the dumpster at the hotel, and were caught. And you know, this just continues day after day after day after day across America, and I'm convinced it is because our society has turned its back on God. I was in a business the other day, Gary, and just was with the technician in the back, and I heard the people working there, the employees of that business up front, talking about churches being so wicked and that they don't pay taxes, you know, they're being tax exempt, and that is an awful wicked thing. They just went on and just vented their hatred against churches in general. They don't know what they're talking about. They just have a deep-seated hatred without natural affection. Society has grown to hate God. Now this is a sign of the times, a sign of the end times. Yeah. And as Paul talks to Timothy, he He is convinced that this type of thing will happen in the last days just before the judgment of God falls upon a wicked world.
And we have to believe that this is the case. A moment ago I mentioned 2 Timothy 3:1. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. I think it's worth going back and looking at the other place that this word occurs. Kalepos here is the word translated perilous. And if you go back over to Matthew 8:28, you read this. And when he was come to the other side into the country of the Gergesenes, there met him two, possessed with devils, coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no man might pass by that way. And that here the term exceedingly fierce is kalepos, which is the same word that Paul uses to describe the last days. In other words, we're talking about demonically possessed, even empowered, perhaps.
So that people fear to
pass
live
by
in that society.
And you know, J.R., people have asked the question. I don't know how many times I've seen television talk shows lately where people have sat around a table and said, why? Well, why is this all happening? And they scratch their heads and they ponder and they muse and they pontificate and they just can't figure out why all this is happening. To me, there is no difficulty at all understanding why.
Yeah. And to me, the Supreme Court is the guilty party, at least has led the way for a society to turn against God. With kicking prayer and Bible reading out of the public schools in the early 60s, and with the Roe versus Wade decision for abortion and against the sanctity of life in the early 1970s, Gary, our society has gone downhill ever since.
And you know, let's take abortion. As soon as you begin to regard a baby in a womb as other than the blessed event that it is, it's really an extension of God's creation in which a new human being is brought into this world for the purpose of redemption. But the moment you change that baby in a womb to what's called in medicine a viable or an unviable tissue mass, in other words, once it's removed, it's just it's gone and everybody forgets about it. As soon as you begin to think of it as a fetus, something that is disposable, a little switch is turned inside your head, and suddenly you are a little bit less human than you were before, and you're willing then to make other choices subsequent to that, and it doesn't take long before you're heartless.
Isn't it amazing how a generation forgets that in the 1930s in Germany, abortion became the law of the land?
That's right.
And abortion then led the people to think of other people as being inhuman. Then came the atrocities against the Jews and the murders of millions of people in World War II.
And all of the Nazi medical experimentation in which people were literally tortured for the purpose of quote-unquote advancement of medicine. Heartlessness, cruelty.
Hollywood, of course, has spurred a lot of this on because of its homosexuality, because of the violence and the sex that it is portrayed on the silver screen. And it has just brainwashed the American people.
And the two boys, for example, on the Jonesburg, Arkansas playground that gunned down their friends, JR, they were merely, in my opinion, acting out what they can see a dozen times a day in the movies and on television. Dress up in camouflage, carry a heavy-duty rifle, and you can become a sort of a miniature version of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you can go out there and do anything your heart desires. It's common to see this on the screen.
You know, it was back in the early 70s when we began to see marriages turn to the divorce courts, and when we began to read in the newspapers more divorces than marriages in most communities across America, the handwriting was on the wall.
And you know, JR, along with this loss of natural affection, in 2 Timothy 3:3, it says, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good. And the word incontinent is in there. And you know, that's a King James word. But translated into modern English, that comes out as road rage. That comes out as a boiling rage that you cannot control. And how often now are we seeing people shooting each other on the highway?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's part of the same downward progression. Once man fails to glorify God, what can I say? That he begins a long trip whose end is the pit.
You see, God has laws. And when we begin to say there is no God, then we are no longer accountable to anybody. And that's where everything starts downhill fast. But I want you to know that Jesus Christ will come one of these days, and those people will be judged. We'll be back in just a moment. Of all of the signs of the second coming of Christ, this one, without natural affection, appears to be the most discouraging. And it is one of the most visible as well. Without understanding, but that's really starting downhill. Covenant breakers. Who cares what they promised?
Right.
Without natural affection, implacable, unwilling to listen to the other side. Unmerciful, showing no mercy. Gary, that speaks of society today, I'm sorry to say.
I'm sorry to say it too. Society is in a state of degeneration. For those of us who know the Lord, there is hope. It is the blessed hope, and we wish that you would live in that regime.
Yes. And if you don't know Christ as your Savior, He still loves you. All you have to do is ask Him to forgive you and save you. I pray that you will. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.